I'm going to go ahead and get started. Try and get out of here maybe a little early if we can, but we have a lot of ground to cover this afternoon, certainly, and this is the technical meat. We will see quite a few more case study example calculations that we can talk through here. This is also your opportunity to ask the detailed questions about these topics now. Certainly the watershed and site assessment and the BMP selection and feasibility are things that we've touched on significantly in the previous modules. And so you'll see some repetition here, but the point is to get into these topics in a little bit greater detail. So this topic really just gets into a little more detail about how to do the project description, site characteristics, and watershed description sections of the WQMP template and what should be included here, but also gets into some of the considerations of what methods folks are using and what guidance the technical guidance document provides on what things need to be looked for. So the whole point of this site assessment effort is to essentially define what performance criteria apply to the site, what are we designing to, and provide the backdrop for selecting the BMPs. And so the minimum level of conformance someone needs to, in terms of the minimum content that someone needs to include in their WQMP needs to be able to support those two things. They need to be able to clearly define why the criteria they're complying to is the right ones, and why their decisions that come later regarding BMPs are justified. So, as I mentioned, the project description is intended to describe the project in analogous to a project description that would be contained in an EIR. This is the envelope within which they're working. It doesn't need to break the project down at the drainage management area level, but it should clearly define what the project is, so that we can define what permit requirements apply. For those of you who are unlucky enough to have two different sets of requirements that apply to different parts of your city, they'll need to define where they are in the jurisdiction. They'll need to define what type of land use they are, where is the project located, and so on. The other purpose of defining the project is to identify the potential pollutants that could be generated by the project. And this is a table from the technical guidance document that helps identify which pollutants would be expected from which types of development projects. Clearly, this doesn't encompass every last permutation of the type of things that we could see within a project, and so we have to use our judgment to understand if sources actually do exist. A high-density attached residential that doesn't have any landscaping, well, likely that there's no pesticide potential to be generated, et cetera. And so from this, we can start to identify, which pollutants of concern we would expect to see, which we wouldn't expect to see. And if we're not going to expect to see one, it would be good to see somebody provide some additional explanation for why not. For example, if we are in a case where we're in attached residential that has no outdoor landscaping, and they circle no, they should provide some explanation for why they don't expect pesticides, for example. This is also the point where we're going to be identifying whether HCOCs exist, and this really belongs in the watershed assessment section because it has nothing to do with the project. Any project is going to have an HCOC if the downstream reaches are susceptible. There's no pre versus post comparison anymore to identify if there's an HCOC. This is a legacy of the project description section of a WQMP, but it's really entirely dependent on what's downstream of the project. So site characteristics. Precipitation zone, obviously a very easy thing for someone to identify. I'll introduce a GIS interface that the county is in the process of developing that makes this even more precise. If someone happened to exist on a zone between two, or in a spot between two zones, and you wouldn't be able to interpret it from the map. Topography. So why do we define the topography of the site? I would say it has a significant implication on the geotechnical recommendations that could follow. If this is a steep site in the existing condition and it's being graded it has to be graded to be able to be developed. That has an implication on some of the constraints that may exist in the future. If we're interested in preserving surface drainage pathways, we're interested in understanding where sediment comes from the perspective of HMP criteria. We need to look for someone to define how the project drains, how that site drains in the current conditions, so that you can evaluate whether they've done what they could do to preserve those drainage pathways. Certainly the soil type and geology at the site play an important role in determining what the feasibility may be on down the road. And so this is an area where you might not have seen much of this in the previous version of WQMP submittals, but you're going to expect to see quite a bit more. You should ask for quite a bit more about what the geology is, and if they're going to claim feasibility, what have they done in terms of testing to demonstrate that that's actually the case. And so getting into geotechnical considerations, the technical guidance document defines these types of technical considerations and talks about what type of conditions may be susceptible to these type of failures and would limit perhaps the amount of infiltration you wanted to do on the site. The geotechnical engineer is also going to have professional discretion in this regard to evaluate factors that they consider to be a risk to public safety, a risk to property, where they would need to limit the amount of infiltration that occurs. Yeah.
You recommend attach the geotech report to the WQMP? Does it have to be?
You need to feel comfortable as a reviewer that the claims are substantiated. I don't know that it necessarily needs to be attached if it's in the public record. If there's a CEQA appendix that's looked at this, that you don't need to have them attach that CEQA appendix to your WQMP again. But if this is if this is recommendation from XYZ geotechnical engineer that we don't know who they are, we don't know.
Well, on geotech, and they have anyway the report for the grading, so we can just attach one copy to the WQMP, and you don't have to look at next time where is the report.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if it's something that you're going to be able to have in your record that substantiates the decisions that are made here, you should make sure that that's clearly referenced and can be dug up at a moment's notice in the case of an audit. You're that water drop, between the regional board and the site engineer, and you want to be able to listen to reason when reason is supported by science, but you also need to be able to defend your decision to the regional board staff who may audit, and that's the nature of the system that we have. And so I would say whatever makes you comfortable about feeling that you have a technically defensible basis for your decision, the actual mechanics of how you do it is up to you. So here's a pop quiz. I mean, if say you have a geotech report and that geotech report has some compelling evidence why infiltration is not feasible, and you've accepted that, do you need to ask someone to do an analysis of groundwater levels and potential soil contamination and potential issues with source water protection? So I don't know if the answer to that is explicitly black and white, but I would say if one thing if one factor is going to eliminate the potential for infiltration, then you don't also need to ask them to evaluate every other factor. Just because these are all factors that could make infiltration infeasible, it doesn't mean that the WQMP needs to go into depth in all of these factors. If infiltration is infeasible and they've chosen to line the BMP for a geotechnical reason, then that's going to be protective of groundwater quality and soil contamination and such. But if the geotech says, no, I could allow some infiltration, then you also probably better be looking for some substantiation that they know that there's not a groundwater plume underneath the site or some soil contamination that could be mobilized as a result of the infiltration. And so some of the things that we're going to be looking for is, shallow groundwater levels. We could get in a situation where the infiltration in a point location results in some mounding, which could either A, violate the permit requirements to maintain 10-foot separation between the BMP and the groundwater table. It could also interfere with site design. With respect to soil and groundwater contamination, we need to think very hard about whether we infiltrate in the vicinity of known contamination. In very limited cases, there may be a cleanup operation underway that would encourage infiltration because it could help speed up the cleanup, but in most cases, I think what we'll see at a site level, try to avoid potentially compounding that contamination by putting additional water on top of it. And you can refer to Appendix 8 in the technical guidance document for more discussion about how to make these decisions regarding groundwater quality and whether it is legitimately a feasibility concern. To flip things on their head, people in certain areas, once they realize that infiltration is a simple and cheap way to comply with this permit, you may be on the other side of the coin. They may be trying to cut some of these corners, and try to do infiltration even when they don't have adequate separation to groundwater, or where their soils will not provide adequate treatment before that water gets to groundwater. That's where these criteria are not a one-way street where someone's always going to push one way against them. They can be pushing the other way against these criteria too, and we need to keep an eye on that. So this is as I mentioned, a simple table where someone can summarize the findings, but we would expect that if one of these is going to control the selection of BMPs and control the way somebody complies with the permit, that we should see a much expanded documentation of the factor that controls. Yeah. I can tell you what the documentation says, and I can tell you that we're working with seasonal high-mounded groundwater and trying to maintain a separation from that. And for some of our shallow surface infiltration BMPs, we've said you need to maintain a 5-foot separation to seasonal high-mounded groundwater from the bottom of your infiltration system. Things like bioretention, where you're providing a good amount of pre-treatment before it goes into the ground. For an underground infiltration device, something like an underground infiltration chamber or a infiltration trench basin that's deeper, those are the type of systems where we want to continue to maintain a 10-foot separation to groundwater. And the permit 10-foot separation specifically applies to those more centralized infiltration devices as opposed to the distributed controls. So we've essentially established a 2-tier requirement, 5 feet for the more distributed and shallower BMPs, 10 feet for the subsurface and deeper BMPs, which have a greater risk of groundwater contamination. So the separation that those reference are based on separation to seasonal high-mounded groundwater. So I would say certainly if the groundwater is within the realm of possibility that it is within those levels, we need to be doing some seasonal testing. We need to obtain actual data that substantiates the groundwater levels. Now, if you have a boring that goes down to 30 feet and never encountered groundwater, I would feel comfortable relying on a geotech engineer's recommendation that it's highly unlikely that we're going to see 15 feet of seasonal change in groundwater and mounding, and therefore it's highly unlikely that we would violate these criteria. So it's a kind of a question of whether it's close or whether it's not. And I tell a story that in Seattle they were retrofitting a neighborhood with green streets in a low-lying area of the city, and they did all their geotech investigation during the summer. It was an American Recovery Act era project that needed to be shovel ready, and they needed to show it was shovel ready. And they did all their testing during the summer. They did final design, they did construction, and construction happened right before the following wet season. And the plants hadn't even established yet, and these things filled up, and a good chunk of them didn't drain. And they didn't drain because there was a seasonal groundwater table that they weren't aware of in the area, that when the rain set in, it would come down off the hills, it would kind of fill up this low-lying area, and it would form a significant kind of seasonal mound. And they ended up having to do $500,000 of a whole bunch of public damage control, like public outreach damage control with the citizens in the area, and they had to do about $500,000 in repairs, filling some in, filling some back in. So it's one of those things where you have to look at it. We can't just assume because we dug a hole and it wasn't there that it's not ever going to be there. But on the other hand, there's a lot more burden of proof or you have a lot better confidence if you have a boring that went to 30 feet and didn't ever encounter it. So, I think that's the case. That's just kind of a lesson with a lot of this this stuff is that we don't need an obvious conclusion to be supported with 100 pages of documentation. We need the conclusions that are close and where we would influence the decision making and could come under scrutiny. We need those to be the ones where more money is focused in the process.
But as a reviewer, it would be up to us to
Yeah.
ask additional questions.
Yeah. Right.
So
Yeah.
the geotechnical professional needs to make some kind of statement
Mm-hmm.
as to whether or not
Mm-hmm.
he anticipates or
Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to show you, I'm just going to go ahead and show you probably your most important reference in this. This is the technical guidance document, and I'm going to go to a table. I'm going to hyperlink to a table, which is going to be the infiltration BMP feasibility worksheet. And so the questions that you're going to see asked are going to be questions like these. And you're going to expect somebody to fill this out as they do their feasibility screening. And so you're going to ask if the infiltration BMP would pose a significant risk to groundwater-related concerns, and you're going to refer to the appendix. But they're going to need to summarize their findings here, and they're going to, if they have none, this is a pretty short finding, and there's maybe no attached report. If they can't answer this simply, then they're going to attach a report and some additional information that would substantiate the way they check the box yes or no. Similar here, would infiltration BMPs pose a significant increased risk of geotechnical hazards that cannot be mitigated to an acceptable level? And so this is where you would summarize the findings, attach the geotech report that substantiates whether they've said yes or no. And there's a series of additional questions here. So what we've tried to do is describe a question that is balanced. It's not just saying, is there any concern about geotechnical issues? It's phrasing it as, are there significant risks that are, in addition to what the project would face anyways, that can't be mitigated? And that's the sort of the context within which you need to work. And sometimes it's going to be a very clear question. You don't need any additional information. Sometimes it's going to be a bit more of a loaded question for this site, and that's where you'll understand that more significant substantiation is necessary. So I'm going to get back into the so we'd be summarizing things here, but ultimately the key findings from this are going to show up in section 4, where somebody's documenting why they picked documenting their feasibility screening and why they picked up a certain BMP and referring you to the report that supports that. So a very simple aspect of the site assessment is, what precipitation zone are you in? So the TGD, as well as this GIS portal that I'll show you, has a number of layers in it that exhibits layers that have already done some pre-screening of potential feasibility considerations that exist, that may exist at a site. And so these are intended not to replace a ground truthing exercise where they ground truth for their site, but it is intended to help someone understand what types of issues might be encountered at the site. So for example, this site, we probably have reason to expect that soil types are not going to be great. We don't have seismic hazard, potential landslide areas right in this area, but we do know that based on the all of the red areas in this, that where slopes are steep, we have potential for landslides. And then ultimately this gets synthesized down to how many overlapping constraints do we have in a given area. This is not exhaustive. One thing that we weren't allowed to put on here was the location of groundwater wells, is for privacy and security purposes. What we don't have on here are all of the various potential cleanup projects that the state has undergoing with lust tanks. We don't have very site-specific factors that might relate to a site. But what this does is it gives you a feel for whether you're likely to be in a little bit easier area, maybe a little harder area, and what factors you might want to look into. One thing I'll point out here is that, or I'll get to it in the next one. So we also should be looking for contaminated sites as well as drinking wells when we think about whether they've checked every box necessary to infiltrate safely. So some additional site characteristics that might be of interest, certainly off-site drainage and what water's coming onto your project and how you're managing that has always been an issue in development planning. Yeah?
Just a quick question on that last slide. Was that supposed to say 250 feet?
Yes, it is. 250 miles. We're all off the hook.
I haven't used GeoTracker in some time. Is that the public doesn't have access to that?
They do. Yeah. I think I can.
What's the difference of publishing the location? I guess it's just
No, I was referring to drinking water wells. Yeah, OCW. This was more of an issue in North Orange County where OCWD operates a lot of wells, and they didn't care to disclose to every person who might download the TGD where those wells were.
If we have remediation well data that should have depth of water in there, can we do it in a whole
Absolutely.
general depth of water map that would be helpful?
Not all these have it, and I am not aware of anyone having done a groundwater mapping exercise in this area.
I wouldn't think it would be too hard. I mean, every single gas station is going to have a monitoring well.
Yeah,
It might be first aquifer, but I think that's just as important when you're doing infiltration.
I'm sure the Orange County Water District has.
yeah, OCWD does, but we're talking about what happens on this side of El Toro Road, and for what Who do you consult with if you do you ever have to consult with groundwater agencies as part of the development approval process? Nobody's really active.
I don't think they're actively contacting.
Yeah. I'll make a note of that. I'm going to go ahead and just do it right now before I forget to just to maybe see if we can clarify this a little bit in the next version of these documents. I'm going to go ahead and keep moving. Okay, so off-site drainage is important for a couple of reasons. If somebody's bringing off-site drainage into their pipes and then bringing it into a BMP, that off-site drainage needs to be included in the sizing calculations. It requires mitigation. As soon as you commingle it with your water from your site, it all needs to be treated. On the other hand, if someone chooses to convey it in a separate pipe or in a separate ditch around the site, there's no obligation of the downstream developer to treat that water. The key thing to remember is just if it commingles, it needs to be treated. So existing utilities are going to be certainly a significant factor in redevelopment projects that could constrain infiltration in certain areas, potentially a constraint in immediate proximity to new development projects, although much less of an argument that existing utilities constrain things in any way relative to new development projects. All right, so here's a hypothetical case study. We have very deep groundwater. It hasn't been encountered in dip borings to 50 foot. No contamination known or suspected. The land uses present have always been single family, and there hasn't been any known risk of contamination or spills. There aren't any ephemeral drainages located downstream. So the geotech has come forth with their standard set of conclusions. They said potential landslide area is a few hundred feet down gradient. You want to avoid any kind of systems that would contribute to lateral migration. So don't infiltrate. Observe a 10-foot minimum setback from foundations and dry utilities. and then nothing else is controlling. There's no offsite drainage. There's no on-site conflicts with utilities, and you're not in an environmentally sensitive area. So the project proponent takes this site assessment and says, I'm not going to infiltrate. What's your response, and where do you think we ought to put some more emphasis on documentation? Anyone? Well, I'm glad to see that you all think about it a lot before you rush into a decision.
How big is the site? I mean, does infiltration necessarily need to affect lateral migration?
Yeah,
Is there an area?
I think that's a very salient observation. What we see here is a sort of a loose logic that any infiltration on this site would contribute to potential risk of landslide failure downstream. What they're not telling you is there actually a reasonable potential that this could occur? So certainly if there is, then you better listen, because the last thing we want to do is create a landslide. But I would ask for a lot more justification that water would actually move laterally. That's not the natural path for water to move. It likes to move downhill unless it finds a confining plane. And B, is this even within a reasonable influence zone of where I could do infiltration on my project? The other thing that I think is sorely missing from this is an assessment of infiltration rates, and whether water would even go into the ground. And if water won't go into the ground, then that's a pretty good reason not to infiltrate. But if water will go into the ground and they can substantiate that, or you start asking the questions and the geotech goes, oh yeah. I mean, if you wanted to infiltrate over on this part of the project, that'd be fine. Then you get them drawing setbacks from that slope where they would want to avoid infiltration, and you can start to balance the risk with the ball that you're trying to move forward on the surface water protection side. So I think my experience with geotechs has been that it's always a question and answer process. They're always going to start with their standard template that they've used on every other project, and they're going to usually start with their standard template recommendations, which is no water in the ground. And it's not until we ask the question of, well, what would actually be the problem associated with infiltrating in this area? What would actually be the problem associated with infiltration in this area? That's when we can start to make progress, and we can start to find something a better balance that approximates the MEP standard we're looking for. But I would also point out that in this case, I would not put much effort, and I would not require the project proponent to put a whole lot of effort into any assessment of groundwater quality considerations or water balance considerations for this site. So this is how they might have filled out this form, but as you know, it's just a snapshot of conditions, and doesn't really tell you the whole story. So the watershed description is the last element of the site assessment, and this is where we're going to define our receiving waters. Hopefully by this point in time we already know what our receiving waters are, because that has a pretty big chain reaction up to what we need to be doing. But it's a chance for us to document that we've considered and we know where the water is draining. We can use these tables in the technical guidance document. These have been simplified now because 2006 list is no longer relevant. But we can use that to help identify what TMDLs and 303D listings apply to the receiving water TMDLs. So if you do get into a case where identifying the priority pollutants of concern controls the selection and treatment control BMPs, it's going to be important that folks do this right. And so the right way to do this is to identify what the receiving water is impaired for or has TMDLs for, and overlay that with the pollutants that are expected to be generated by the project. And where those two intersect, that's where we have our primary POCs. So these are really what governs the selection of treatment control BMPs if you're at that point. Your other pollutants of concern are those that are expected to be generated but are not currently causing an impairment downstream. So other parts of your watershed assessment are really going to be, is this an area that is within an environmentally sensitive area? And so the implication of that is that it reduces the threshold that would trigger a priority project down to 2,500 square feet if it's within an environmentally sensitive area. And so this is defined as within I believe it's defined as within a 200-foot setback from 303D listed water bodies or projects that discharge via direct pipe to those water bodies. And so there's some additional guidance on how to determine this in the TGD. And relative to HMP considerations for watershed site assessment, that's where you'll find all the guidance in that document relative to characterizing where sediment sources are and understanding whether something is susceptible downstream. So an example of just the summary table in this case. And so I wanted to share with you, to close this session out, I wanted to share with you a tool that the county is in the process of developing. And I'll say that again, in the process of developing. Grant Sharp has been working hard on this and has a team working on it. And he's really excited about the potential. I am too. I think it's a really cool tool that they're developing. So the way we get to it is from the OC Watershed's webpage. And you hopefully know how to get there, OC Watersheds. And then if you go under Documents and you go under Water Quality Management Plan, so this is kind of your landing page for all things WQMP related. And you should note that right now the 2003 program documents are on here for south of El Toro Road. In the next month, these will be updated with the current program documents that reflect the new program. But scrolling back up, you'll see a link to the county's geo-research portal. And so just clicking on this and making sure you have Silverlight installed on your machine, you'll get an opportunity to load up this map. And I'll just go ahead and give you a quick tour. What you'll see is the city's or the county's parcel database has become available, and this was in response to a lawsuit actually that requires them to make their parcel data available. And so this is the format that they're making that available in. So you can do a search all the way down to parcel layer. Hey Joe, what is the address here? What's the address? Yeah. Huh. Well, it's supposed to complete.
Just type in,
Marguerite Parkway, 1802. We'll just go ahead and grab that one. So we can zoom to that looks like a nice landscape strip. But you can when you know a parcel address, you can zoom to a parcel and you'll get all the parcel information, the APN and so on. Go into the layers button up here will allow you to turn on and off different layers. And so what you'll see of interest here is a number of layers related to OC watersheds. And so we have expandable subheadings underneath each one of these. And so we can start with infiltration constraints, take a look at how many infiltration constraints apply to a given parcel. We can then turn this off and turn on the sublayers. So shallow groundwaters, we don't have that mapped in this area, so it's likely it's not that it's likely not an issue, it's just not mapped yet. OCWD production wells, OCSD. So none of these are going to apply, but now we can turn on our desoils layers, and so you can see how desoils interact with this. We won't be looking at any of the plumes Those are all mapped in North Orange County, but we can start to identify the landslide hazard zones, as applying in some of these areas. Then we can identify hydrologic conditions to concern. We can map channel types. So if I turn this off and zoom back out a bit, we can start to, for those of you who are not colorblind, you can start to understand what type of channels exist downstream of the project and where water tends to drain. Preliminary mapping, and as Daniel implied, there's some uncertainty in what areas will be considered to be potential HCOC susceptibility and which ones will be exempt from the hydro modification control plan. And so as you can see now, much of South Orange County is considered to be an area of potential erosion considerations, which would imply hydromod susceptibility. But the working nature of this map is such that this is all contingent on the HMP exclusions. So a number of other features that may be of interest. You can look at the design capture storm depth plotted on the map, I think. I thought we had that. Oh, we have to turn this on. So now we can get a feel for what zone we're in, and we can look at the legend here to figure out which we are. It looks like we're in the 0.85 inch design capture storm depth zone, and so on. So you can also find flood control layers loaded up in here. You can find the storm drains right here, and you'll find Orange County Flood Control District as well as local storm drains that are loaded up in this in this document, right, in this portal. And certain cities have contributed these storm drains, and others haven't. So you'll see a kind of a county-wide presence of storm drain layers, but the local storm drain layers are more of a site by site or a city by city basis, whether they'll show up. So in any case, this is just an indication of a tool that's out there. We'll be making refinements to it. So Grant is open to any suggestions folks have about how to make it more useful. So give it a try, play with it, see what would be helpful from your end in terms of any tweaks. The county fully owns this platform, so they have their own in-house programmers who are making these modifications and can make any customizations really that are technically possible. But they don't have to go back to a software vendor and get them to change things. Yeah, was there a question?
In terms of calculating the constraints on there, I
Mm-hmm.
missed this, but no constraints, especially with regards to historical landslide areas.
Mm-hmm.
So someone take a look at that list there of infiltration constraints, 1, 2, 3, 4. Is
That's
that
the
in and of itself, just by looking up an address and a parcel, good enough to say that that's not a good place to infiltrate?
No, it's not. It's a screening tool to help you understand how much of an issue there may be. The TGD, and I think I have a slide about this, and in case I don't, I'll just talk about it now. So the question was about whether a mapped designation of an infiltration constraint was enough. Project address pointing at the map saying I got 3 overlapping constraints, if that's enough to consider something infeasible. And so the two-part question of the answer. One is that the TGD defines quote-unquote large projects and small projects. So the intent is for small projects to be defined and help them provide a little simpler pathway through the process. And it would be primarily based on things that they can pull from a map and any available data that they have at the site. So what we require is that they do some level of ground truthing. It doesn't need to be a full-on infiltration test. If they have a mapped D-soil and they can go out and dig a pit, or they can show you a historic boring that substantiates that they have, yes, indeed, clay soils on this site, then that's enough. That's enough for those type of projects. Now, if they can't produce any evidence that the map designation actually applies to their site, it's a much weaker proof, because a map at this scale is going to be wrong in a lot of cases. And so I would always look for at least some supporting evidence that the map designation holds true.
In the case of historical landslide areas, though, the only record that they have of that is a map, for the most part, or a past geotechnical report, so why wouldn't that be sufficient by itself?
Oh, a past geotechnical report, or something that has the resolution that it was intended to be used at a site scale, like a geologic map, or a past geotechnical report that substantiates that there's historic landslides on site. I see no reason why that couldn't be brought to bear as a site-specific ground truthing of that condition. Yeah. And particularly for small projects, that's a perfect example of the concept here, is that we don't want to take a 12,000 square foot project and say, you got a historic landslide, but have you paid a geotech to look at that landslide and determine whether it actually poses a risk and whether that risk can be mitigated? These type of questions are relevant for big projects. I will say that big projects need to be considering these types of things, because they have more flexibility within their site plan. They also have more flexibility within their budget to ask and answer some of these questions. But for smaller projects, we need to provide some common sense pathway through for them. Yeah. So anyways, that's the end of this session. I would just encourage you to take a look at this when you have a chance. This is really intended to be a resource for you, for project preparers. I know that some of the terminology, some of the legends are not very clear at this point. The 1, 2, 3, 4 is really not it's not annotated accordingly, and so on. And we've passed those comments along to Grant, but he's open to any other comments that you have on this. Going to move into BMP selection and feasibility, and it's funny that we tend to get into feasibility in our previous discussions, because that's really one of the key things that influences how we why we do site assessment and so on. So this one I'm probably going to zoom through a little more quickly to make sure that we leave enough time for the site assessment, or the hydrologic sizing methods, as well as Daniel and Remy's work with the HMP and how to use the SOCM model. So forgive, I'm probably going to cruise through this one in the interest of not covering discussion that we've already covered. So we've talked about the BMP hierarchy. I think we have pretty good understanding of what the BMP hierarchy is. When I say BMP hierarchy, I mean attempting to use infiltration and harvest and use BMPs, and then after that going to a biofiltration type design with the remaining volume. We haven't talked about site design BMTs too much, but we have talked about those that we can take credit for, namely hydrologic source controls. We'll show a case study of how these could potentially fit into the BMP selection process, and talk about a little bit more detail about BMP feasibility screening, but at the risk of boring you with repetition, we'll probably skip through some of that. So the hierarchy is something I've already covered several times, but it's written into the model WQMP, and it's directly from the permit. We've also talked about the developing the performance criteria that apply, and which hierarchy applies, which sizing standard is going to control hydromod versus the LID sizing criteria. And we ask, in the guidance, we ask someone when they first start laying out their site plan and first start selecting BMPs, calculate the design capture volume. Just just calculate it at a site scale. It's going to be broken down, but calculate it at a site scale and divide it by a certain depth of a typical depth of a BMP. Very simple way to calculate a footprint. Divide that by the total site area, and so that you understand, am I working with 2% of my site area? Am I working with 4% of my site area, 6% of my site area? This is not necessarily a compliance target. This is just a planning step of let's start with a general understanding of how much room we need to leave in our site. And so we can do that by looking up the rainfall zone, finding the key sort of just metadata about our project, how much impervious cover it has, where it's located, and identifying the project performance criteria that apply in each category. So this is where we're going to bifurcate. This is where we're going to see someone defining their project performance criteria, and if hydromod controls, they're going to probably bifurcate and go down a hydromod design route, as Daniel and Remy are going to talk about. If LID controls, they're probably going to go down the LID design route, which is really what's supported by the technical guidance document. So in this case, what they've done is they've determined that the project it does not have hydromod susceptibility. It's exempt from hydromod. So the LID BMP criteria are going to control the design of the site and the selection of BMPs. So this is just an example way that we can use worksheet B to figure what that total DCV requirement is for the project site. So this is an example of site design, and I've made a lot of fun of 1990 site design, so I guess I need to say that this is an example of 2013 site design. We're, instead of designing the site, laying things out all based on what the project proponent wants in terms of parking spaces and density, and then at the end of the design process saying, oh darn, I have a BMP requirement that I need to meet, and I'm going to put that in a vault at the end of the pipe near the downstream end of the project. We need to be doing conceptual drainage planning and preliminary site planning at the same time. And some of the things that you can encourage folks to consider is to think about site design in terms of allowing BMPs near the existing connection to the storm drains. Those are the prize spots of the site from a water quality perspective, because you can pick up the majority of the site in one location, and you don't have this pesky down gradient area that's downstream of your BMP and still upstream of where your project discharges off-site. Another example, this is a high-density example, but if you're going to use underground parking, why not locate that within the building footprints rather than underneath the parking areas? Because parking areas represent an ideal opportunity for infiltration. They're typically set back from anything structural, any structural buildings. You may have to deal with utilities, but they represent a good opportunity for doing stormwater management, except when there's an underground parking structure below the parking lot. So if there's flexibility to do that, identifying areas that can be self-retaining. So the TGD recommends using hydrologic source controls first, and thinking about which areas of the project that we can completely disconnect from the downstream system, and therefore don't factor into the sizing of their downstream controls. And each one of the hydrologic source control fact sheets defines the amount of credit you can take for a certain amount of control. So if you can, for example, install permeable pavement that has less than a 1 part impermeable draining to 1 part permeable, then that can be considered to be a self-retaining area of the site, and you don't need to do explicit sizing calculations. You don't need to do a lot of additional heartburn. That's area you carve out. That's the donut hole in your site, and now you treat everything else, but you assume that during that design storm, that area is not going to contribute runoff. And so for taking a pretty high density site, what can we do? And we see that they've put their underground parking below the facility here. That's a good step. That frees up certain buffers along this parking here, and maybe certain areas of this parking where you could potentially infiltrate. We potentially think about taking these drive islands, which might be a little challenging to route to a BMP, and maybe converting half of those to permeable pavement and creating those as self-retaining areas. And you can start chipping away at this design capture volume and reduce the amount of space you need to give up on the site for those BMPs. So they're thinking about the discharge. These are shown in white, so that's really problematic for being able to see them. But thinking about where the discharge locations are from the site when you lay out your site. And this is, of course, the site that was developed before these requirements were in place, and now we're kind of trying to fit them in. But they could have probably done things a little bit better, even if they would have thought about these requirements when they were laying out the site. So after you've laid out the site and you've divided the site up into the drainage management areas, you know generally where your BMPs should go in this site. This is where we're going to look at a drainage management area by DMA basis, and we're going to say what is the right BMP for this drainage management area. And feasibility conditions can vary a lot across the site. You may have a portion of your site that has shallow fills, has nice soils underneath, isn't adjacent to a slope. The more water we can route to that part of the site, and doing feasibility analysis specifically on that area is going to result in more infiltration on the site basis than just saying, we have fill depths across the site, we can't do any infiltration at all. So the feasibility screening process starts with hydrologic source controls, and this is not a feasibility screening process. This is just doing whatever's applicable for the project. Clearly, if you have no yards, then disconnecting downspouts over pervious area is not applicable. We're not going to force you to go from a high-density multifamily to a single family so that you can do hydrologic source controls. It makes no sense. We're talking hydrologic source controls are opportunistic, and you're going to do those first. You're going to take any areas that can be fully self-retaining and pass go right to collect $200. But the remaining areas, now we're going to go through some simple screening gates. And this is our in-feasibility screening that we're going to do here. Either you can do the whole thing or you can't. And if you can do the whole thing, pass go, collect $200, do it that way. If you can't do it with either infiltration or harvest and use fully, well, now you're into an area where we're going to do what we can, and we're going to make up the rest with biofiltration if we can. And so this is a bit more rigorous analysis. We hope that we'll catch most projects in this type of a question, rather than forcing a lot of projects and reviewers to deal with these questions that relate a little bit more in degrees rather than in black and white. So what things do we need to think about in the feasibility analysis? We've alluded to several of these and hit some of them fairly hard, but I wanted to give you a summary of what factors come into the decision making for the TGD. So we can think about this in three different ways. We can think about just sheer physical limitations. Water will not go into the ground. Clearly, that was part of what was intended by feasibility. So we think about soil rates, we think about limiting soil horizons, cases where water will go into the ground, but then it's going to migrate laterally, it's going to pop right out down the slope down the way. That's not permanent retention. Nothing really is. But then we also have risk of impacts. And so this is maybe could consider it a little bit more about desirability. We don't use the word desirability, but because the permit doesn't. But risk of impacts is clearly recognized by the permit and by the technical guidance document as being factors that would limit feasibility. And so these are things like groundwater, geotechnical conditions. Some things that I haven't talked about are things like inflow and infiltration into areas that are managed by old sewer systems, and the potential transferal of impacts. You're making surface water quality better and making the CSO or the potential for SSOs, sanitary sewer overflows, worse. I'm not sure how many parts of this part of the county this would really apply to. It's certainly a concern of OC San up in North Orange County. The other thing that we do have to be thinking about here, especially if we're thinking about infiltrating to a pretty significant scale upstream of ephemeral drainage, is the potential for us to change the overall water balance of that drainage. And the best example of this are some of these streams that have gone from being ephemeral to more of a perennially flowing stream as a result of the imported water that is brought in. And an additional emphasis on infiltration has the potential to put even more water into this groundwater condition that might be already seeing more than natural. And then finally, we have a permit that recognizes that redevelopment projects could face significant challenges, that space requirements are a big factor in those challenges, that sometimes these LID requirements are not compatible with dense development goals in certain village center type areas of cities. We also have potentially competition with reclaimed water where that's available that would mean that we should be thinking about the balance between trying to harvest and use water versus using reclaimed water that's already available and is available year-round. And then finally, there is the opportunity for you to consider cost. The TGD has not attempted to define a specific fraction of a project cost, for example, that would render a certain solution infeasible, but the permit recognizes the importance of cost-benefit quotient in determining whether a waiver should be granted for a BMP. And so that's something that's at your disposal, although there isn't a standardized county guidance criteria really directly related to cost. What you'll see is we've tried to backstop against excessive cost by providing a lot of feasibility outs where conditions aren't right, as well as backstopping how much of a development project we would expect someone to sacrifice for water quality. So we can think about a feasibility analysis really in two parts, and this is again trying to help most projects get through things fairly simply, and more complicated projects providing guidance for them to do battle with interpreting the MEP standard. But we can first think about the first phase is in terms of infeasibility screening. So getting rid of BMPs that are clearly infeasible in favor of selecting BMPs that are safe and more likely to be effective. And then the more nuanced questions related to what is the maximum retention. Say I do have feasible retention BMPs, but they're taking up too much of my site, or site conditions are just not conducive to doing the full design capture volume in a retention BMP. What backstops do I have to say that I've done things to the MEP before I move along? And so this is really embodied in section 2.4 of the technical guidance document. This is really what you'll find in appendix 11 of the technical guidance document. So the infeasibility screening questions are intended to be those yes/no questions that I flashed up on the screen from the technical guidance document, a number of them. These are those rain gardens in Seattle that didn't ever drain. The infeasibility screening also does touch on the ability to actually use the water that you capture, and that being a really important aspect. This, of course, is not a form of failure that's going to cause anybody any public harm, but it's certainly not going to make water quality any better if we allow people to just put in cisterns and never use them. And so the actual ability to use the water is what we've defined as actually an infeasibility screening criteria. And so the result is, of course, when we narrow down that menu of BMPs, we allow someone to focus on things that are more likely to be feasible. This is an example of yes/no questions. I've already showed you that. I'm gonna expand on this just a little bit because this is worthy of a mention. The infiltration rate. So if infiltration rate is, okay, I'm gonna start by just telling you what the criteria are, and then I'll ask some questions. So the threshold for feasibility is 0.3 inches per hour. And this rate, before you compare your site rate to the 0.3 inches per hour, you have to divide your site rate by 2, a factor of safety of 2. And here's the basis for that. We know that when even the best geotech engineer with the hugest budget known to man is going to go out to a site, they're going to do some tests, And there's going to be some uncertainty in those tests about what they actually measured, how they converted it to a vertical infiltration rate, how that site's going to respond with construction, how BMPs are going to perform over time, and what sort of decline in infiltration rate we may see with seasons and with temperature and with clogging and so on. And so the idea that we can ever narrow our factor of safety to less than 2 is, I believe, irresponsible to think that we should. And so what we've said is that someone, when they're screening for feasibility, takes that rate that they've measured in the field, applies a factor of safety of 2, not more than 2, not less than 2, to determine whether infiltration is potentially feasible at their site. And the reason why we don't let them go greater than 2, of course, is that someone could just jack that up and prove infiltration is infeasible everywhere. And we also want to avoid that. So we're trying to do this responsibly, but we're also trying to require that people move the ball forward. And so, as I mentioned, for small projects, someone can use regional maps and available data to substantiate that their professional opinion is that the rate is less than 0.3 inches per hour. For larger projects, there must be a numeric investigation, infiltration testing that goes on to substantiate whether they're above or below the threshold. And so the question is, what if we do come back with an infiltration rate of 0.1 inches per hour, but no other recommendations from the geotech, no other limitations? What does that tell us about how we need to approach BMP sizing? And I bring this up because, to be honest, I think cutting to the chase, this is going to be the case in 80% of development projects that we see. And so, cutting to that chase, getting down to practical nature, we're probably going to see a lot of projects that don't meet this 0.3 inch per hour threshold. We're going to see a lot of projects where there really aren't many other constraints. And the approach there is that being below 0.3 inches basically allows us to, if we go back to this chart here, being below 0.3 inches per hour tells us that it's not feasible to retain the remaining infiltration volume. That's a no. And we probably are answering no to harvest and use, and I'll get to that. We are going to biotreat, and we're going to design biotreatment BMPs or biofiltration BMPs with an elevated underdrain, so that the sump below that underdrain essentially provides the maximum feasible retention, and the biofiltration area above that underdrain provides the biofiltration for the remaining volume. So there's a lot of criteria in here. In a lot of cases, that's going to be the pathway that someone uses when rates are low, but everything else appears to be conducive for some infiltration. What's Appendix 11 says is that if you're going to use biofiltration BMPs, those biofiltration BMPs need to be designed to achieve the maximum feasible incidental infiltration. And it says that if you don't have any other conditions that are limiting infiltration, then calculate the amount of the depth of water that would drain in 24 hours at the rate that exists. And even if that rate is 0.05 inches per hour, 0.2 inches per hour, calculate that amount that would infiltrate in 24 hours and provide storage for that amount below the underdrains of your system. And then count that as retention, subtract that from your design capture volume, and provide the remaining in a biofiltration system above that. So it's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple way to say, I've done everything, I've retained what I can for this site. I'm using this BMP that if infiltration goes to 0 in the long term, all I have is some water stored below the underdrains that isn't ever going to drain, but I still have a system that's draining the surface. It's not killing plants. It's not creating a vector nuisance, and I can, it will continue to function and provide a water quality benefit with time. So I think there's a pretty, when hydromod doesn't apply, there's a pretty clear pathway for a lot of these sites that might otherwise be, gosh, how do I navigate this? How do I navigate these criteria? First retaining and then biofiltering. Do I need 2 separate BMPs? Well, practically speaking, we need to be pushing people towards more of a belt and suspenders type approach. Take the retention that we can, biofilter on top of that. Use one footprint. Yeah.
Go back to the safety factor of 2.
Yeah.
I thought there's calculations in place for that were dependent on a number of factors.
You're-
like soil variability,
You're right.
compaction, all
Yep.
that stuff, where there could be a variance and limits to.
Yes. Yeah. So we're in the infeasibility screening section, but that's a good point in that we're not going to allow someone to go above 2 for infeasibility screening, but Appendix 7, at the end of Appendix 7, we provide a table to help someone weight the different factors that could require a factor of safety, or could imply that a higher factor of safety is necessary, and that's where we could allow someone to go higher than 2 if they feel like it's necessary, or if you as a reviewer feel like this site has the potential to be pretty dirty. They're not providing a great deal of pretreatment, or there's a lot of variability across the site and they haven't characterized that variability very well. And this is where you as a reviewer can tell them, I think a higher factor of safety on these measured infiltration rates would be good. And that's going to force the developer to maybe use a BMP that's a little shallower and a little broader to achieve the same level of infiltration. But if that's justified based on the site, then I fully support that. So it's the difference between what we call K-measured, which is what we compare against the feasibility threshold, and K-design, which is what someone's going to use for their design calculations.
So just let me clarify, it's never acceptable to have them say, I didn't meet this, or I couldn't meet the threshold, so I can't infiltrate. They have to infiltrate what they can, and then retain the remaining part?
Biofilter the remaining part?
Yeah.
If they have a good reason why that no water should be allowed in the ground, like for example a groundwater quality consideration, or a basement, or one of these things, then they're allowed to line the system, achieve no infiltration, and biofilter it all. If the only restriction they're up against is the 0.3 inch per hour and they're less, then what the TGD says is select biofiltration BMPs. It's your prerogative to select biofiltration BMPs, but you need to design them to achieve the maximum feasible incidental infiltration. And that's where that 24-hour calculation that I mentioned comes into play. So you're essentially requiring them to do your biofiltration, but provide me with a stone storage layer that would be equal to what would infiltrate in 24 hours.
That's like the age-old argument, right? Is the geotech will say absolutely no water,
Mm-hmm.
but everybody knows they're gonna landscape it with sprinklers constantly every day. So, I mean, that's the argument we have.
And I've had this discussion with geotechs in a context where we were required to retain everything we could as part of a CEQA proceeding and a waste discharge requirement. And what we did was we actually defined two different types of infiltration so that they could keep it clear in their mind that there's full infiltration of the design capture volume. So the 85th percentile storm all going into the ground in a certain area. And then there's what we call the type 2 infiltration, which is this incidental infiltration, but it has essentially a relief valve. It has that underdrain that will carry any additional water away. And what I've found is when you actually break down those types of infiltration to a geotech, they see the type 2 infiltration as being a lot more like the incidental infiltration that they already account for in their calcs, because they do irrigate. Now, you expect that water percolates through a pavement layer as the pavement cracks and water gets into the subbase. There's no way to keep a fill entirely dry. There's no way to keep a site entirely dry. And so when you characterize this as more in terms of this is partial infiltration with a backup system, I find that folks are a lot more accepting of this type of approach. That said, if they have a good reason why there shouldn't be any water in the fill, by all means, this is just a way for us to strike, to try to strike a happy medium between balancing real risk with water quality protection. I saw you shaking your head, Joe. trying to keep you happy. And so this is an elaboration on what I was talking about to help address your question about what we're using. So we clearly are going to need the geotech to make a conversion from what may be measured as a three-dimensional percolation rate to something that would be more analogous to a vertical percolation rate, okay? That's what we're calling K observed. K measured is what we compare against the feasibility criteria of 0.3 inches per hour, and this is always based on a factor of safety of 2. And then K design, which is used in all of our sizing calculations, and you'll see how this comes into play. K design is a minimum factor of safety of 2, but can be more. A larger site with more spatial variability, less degree of characterization, could certainly justify a higher factor of safety to be used in design. So harvest and use, some of the things that would get us into a case where harvest and use is considered to be clearly infeasible would be that if inadequate demand exists for the harvested water. So we've characterized, I showed the example of the TUDIA ratio, the toilet users to impervious area. That's a simple screening metric that folks can use to determine whether demand exists for harvested water. We also have ratios of landscaped area to impervious area to help provide a surrogate for how much water they would actually be able to use during the winter months of the year when water is available. So if we also have to recognize that this is not setting public health laws, and so if the use of harvested water would conflict with codes or ordinances that can't be waived as part of the project, then that use of harvested water would be not allowed and wouldn't be able to factor in. I'll be honest. It takes a very unique project with a unique set of drivers for this to make a lot of sense to pencil out. And I would also say that typically someone who doesn't want to do it is going to find an out in the form of either not having enough demand during the wet season, not having a consistent demand during the wet season, perhaps not being able to use the water for what they want to use it for based on health code stuff. We've had this in place for 2 years in North Orange County, and we haven't seen a single harvest and use system come online, at least from any of the co-permittees that I've interacted with. And so I don't think this is a really viable option. Partly with respect to how the storm events arrive here. It's not a matter of getting that nice half-inch dump every few days to keep your cistern full. It's a matter of getting 8 inches of rain in January when you have nearly no demand for harvested water at all. So there's a lot of reasons why this doesn't work. What we were not able to do is remove this entirely, and so what we tried to do is provide a lot of technical reasons why someone could take an off-ramp, but with the intent that as codes change and perhaps as water rates change and perhaps as more this gets incentivized for other reasons, that we wanted to have a structure that would be permissive, and part of this is not allowing someone just to put in a cistern that never drains and consider that to be full compliance. We want to, with development, stormwater management, we want to be moving the ball forward on TMDL compliance and on just overall improvement of receiving waters. We just don't. It's not a matter of just checking a box. And so the big part of this is, as you'll see in the sizing calculations, is making sure that we're actually capturing a good chunk of the average annual runoff volume rather than just the first storm of the year. So with ET, so ET is mentioned on the same playing field as harvest and use and infiltration in our hierarchy. ET, harvest and use or infiltrate to retain the design capture volume. But ET itself is not something you have much control over, and we actually wouldn't want to be incentivizing folks to put a really high ET pallet on their site, because all that's going to do is generate more water demand during the dry parts of the year. And so we consider ET to be maximized for a site. In essence, we're able to check that box. When someone has used all of the hydrologic source controls that are available to them, and they've also designed BMPs in a way that maximizes potential ET. And so by using an amended media with plants, that's a BMP approach that that results in evapotranspiration. Now, can we quantify the benefits of that different from biofiltration and infiltration? We don't ask someone to do that, but what we can say is that ET is maximized when we apply the applicable HSCs, and we also use biofiltration BMPs to treat water. And so biofiltration BMPs obviously are needed to address the remaining unmet volume, and where feasibility conditions allowed, these biofiltration BMPs themselves should be designed to achieve incidental volume reduction. So I'm going to kind of zoom through this. We've already kind of talked about these. So just going to point you towards some resources for feasibility analysis. So in section 2.4, that was where I jumped to when I went into the TGD. This is where you're going to find those essential feasibility questions that you can use judgment to see if someone is adequately answered. Then we go to the appendices, and so appendix 4, section 2.4 will also have those common scenarios that someone may encounter and their pathway through the documents in terms of documenting this. Appendix 7, infiltration rates, methods of evaluating those, as well as methods of selecting factors of safety. This also provides guidance on small projects versus large projects and what the obligations are for those projects in assessing infiltration rates. Appendix 8, groundwater-related feasibility criteria. Appendix 10 is where we have the rainwater harvesting feasibility screening criteria, also known as harvest and use. And so this is where someone's going to take a quick look. They're going to see how they fit into this structure, and they're going to stop looking any further for the most part. Appendix 11 is where we'll find these criteria for designing BMPs to achieve the maximum feasible retention and biotreatment. So this is the MEP appendix, essentially. And then Appendix 14, we'll see BMP fact sheets. And we also have a training module that we're not going to present today, just in the interest of time, but it has more discussion about more advanced feasibility considerations. And I'm going to skip over hydromod BMPs because Daniel and Remy are going to talk about those. And finally, source control BMPs. This is same as before. This is a simple, is this applicable? I'm going to use it. If it's not applicable, I'm not going to use it. And if it's not applicable, provide an explanation for why it's not applicable to the site. Okay, so it's a good discussion on feasibility. We did not get into sizing. That's the next topic. And does anybody need how are we doing on film, Brian? We good?
Yeah, we got about an hour.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to do some sizing examples, talk about the sizing requirements that apply.